Hi, my name is Anna, and I'm here to tell you about my experiences working with a group called the International Women's Peace Service, which is based in the West Bank, and basically we do two things. First of all, we're there to document human rights abuses in the region, and second of all, we're there to support nonviolent resistance to the occupation. And I'll be telling you more about what this occupation looks like in the presentation, but before I do so, just a little bit about myself. I'm a Jewish American, and I originally got into this work when I was living in Turkey, and I would take trips through the Middle East during my vacations. I was in Iran, in Syria, and Lebanon, and along my way I was taken in by families, many of them Palestinian refugees, and through my friendships with these people that I met along the way, I began to hear for the first time a whole different sort of version of the history and present of Israel and Palestine, utterly different from anything that I'd ever learned growing up as a Jewish American. And I was very disturbed, alarmed by what I heard. I didn't believe it. I thought it was all propaganda. But it sort of planted a seed, and I began to do some of my own research and eventually decided to go to Palestine to see with my own eyes what was happening. And that's when I took my first trip to Palestine. And that's what I'd like to tell you about, is what I found when I got there. I'm not here to give sort of a sweeping analysis of the entire history of the conflict. I'm not here to give every single perspective on the issue. I'm here to give my perspective as a Jewish American who spent 5 months working in the West Bank. Now, when I first got to Palestine, there were of course many sort of surprises along the way, but one of the first ones was just aesthetically the way Palestine looked. I guess I'd imagined the Middle East to be sort of rolling sand dunes, barren desert land, and when I got there I realized that Palestine was actually very beautiful. This is a picture showing Palestine in the springtime. You can see how fertile and green the land is. But beyond showing how beautiful it is, I actually think that this photograph captures what I have come to believe is really at the heart of the Israel-Palestine conflict. A lot of people have sort of a perception of this issue as being kind of an age-old rivalry between Jews and Muslims, something that's been going on for thousands of years and will continue for thousands more because at its heart are these sort of deep religious differences. And one of the first realizations that I came to when I got to Palestine was that for the most part, this really is not a war about religion. This is a war about land, about water, about resources. And I hope that my reasons for coming to those conclusions will be clear in this presentation. Now, to get you oriented, here's a map of the Middle East. Israel and Palestine are located in the Middle East. That tiny little purple and white sliver there, here's a larger version of that map, and the beige areas in this map indicate the de facto internationally recognized borders of the State of Israel. Meanwhile, the pink areas on the right and left are the two landmasses making up the Palestinian territories occupied in 1967. And they are on the left, the Gaza Strip, and on the right, the West Bank. And I was living in a town, in a village in the West Bank, and the photographs and stories from this presentation were taken from the West Bank. So, as I said, these are known as the occupied Palestinian territories. Occupied, what does that word mean, right? Well, the purpose of my presentation is to tell you about this occupation. And the first part of my talk is just explaining the structures of the occupation. What is it composed of? I'll be talking about restricted movement, checkpoints and roadblocks. I'll be talking about settlements and outposts. I'll be talking about the wall, and I'll be talking about imprisonment. And once we have sort of a general understanding about what the system itself looks like, I'll be talking about how are people reacting? How are people resisting? And the next part of my talk then will be about resistance. I'll be talking about everyday nonviolent resistance. I'll be talking in particular about demonstrations. And I have a section as well on Israeli activism. So to get started with restricted movement. In the Palestinian territories, there are both Palestinians and Israelis living there, but they use different roads. There are Palestinian roads, there are Israeli roads. Palestinian roads tend to be older, often even unusable like the one you see in this photograph. Israeli roads tend to be more modern, constructed by the Israeli government for Israeli citizens living in these territories, and they might be sort of four-lane highways like the one you see in this photograph. Palestinians are not allowed to use the Israeli roads unless they're able to obtain a kind of permit, in which case they might be able to use, say, a certain section of a certain road, but in all other cases the roads are segregated. Palestinians and Israelis use different colored license plates. Palestinian cars have green or white colored plates, meanwhile Israeli cars have yellow colored plates. And this is so it's easy to see from afar whether a vehicle is carrying Palestinians or Israelis. And it also makes it easier for the soldiers who are manning the area to monitor who is using which road. So for example, here you can see an army jeep pulling over all green or white plated vehicles to the side of a road, meanwhile all yellow plated vehicles are allowed to pass by unhindered on the left. And this is called a checkpoint. And checkpoints are a major institution in the occupation. They are essentially barriers manned by soldiers or border police that are used to control Palestinian pedestrian or vehicular movement. And the idea behind a checkpoint is more or less what you might experience like at a border crossing, where you go, you stand in line, you show your ID, you answer a couple questions, maybe open up your bag. One of the main differences with checkpoints in the Palestinian territories, as you can see from this map of the permanent checkpoints installed in the West Bank, those little blue things, is that the vast majority of these checkpoints are not located around the border of the West Bank, but actually the vast majority of them are located internally within the Palestinian territories, namely most of them between Palestinian towns and villages. And what this means for a Palestinian person who's living, let's say, just south of Hebron in the south of the West Bank, who wants to travel, 30 miles north to the city of Bethlehem, which is a little bit more towards Jerusalem. So 30 miles, that should take a person under normal circumstances like 30, 40 minutes, maybe an hour tops. Well, it's very likely to take that Palestinian person anywhere from 2 hours to 4 hours to 8 hours to maybe even an entire day to travel just those 30 miles because of the number of times that he or she would be stopped along the way at these checkpoints. And well, this is obviously very frustrating. People are spending hour after hour, day after day at these checkpoints to get from any one place to another. But beyond just being sort of a frustration, these checkpoints are extremely disabling to Palestinian daily life, to all aspects of Palestinian daily life. For example, these checkpoints make it very difficult for a Palestinian person to hold a steady job. It's never clear if it's going to take you 10 minutes or 3 hours to commute from your little village to the nearest city. Similarly, attending classes on a regular basis is pretty much impossible. Unless you happen to have a university in your little village, higher education is basically out of the question. So beyond just being sort of an annoyance or a burden, these checkpoints are preventing Palestinians from earning a living and from getting an education. Beyond that, getting to a marriage, a funeral, graduation, going to visit your family, all aspects of daily life are affected. And imagine if you, every time you wanted to go to work or to school or to church or wherever else you were going, that you had to go through a series of checkpoints that held you up for 2-3 hours. How would that affect your life? And maybe that gives you sort of a glimpse of how disabling these checkpoints have become to Palestinians just sort of on a daily basis. This is the checkpoint outside of the city of Nablus. It's called Huwara. And we were there doing checkpoint watch, where we basically document what's happening at these checkpoints. And on this day, the rule was the following. Women were allowed through the checkpoint, older men were allowed through the checkpoint, and young boys were also allowed through the checkpoint. But any men between the ages of 15 and 40 weren't. Period. It didn't matter where you were coming from, it didn't matter where you were going, it didn't matter who you were, it didn't matter if it was an emergency. If you were Palestinian male, 15 to 40 years of age, you couldn't get home or to work or to school or to the hospital or wherever you were going. And so they gathered here, literally hundreds of Palestinian men in this ditch next to the checkpoint in hopes that the rule would change at some point. And at one point I saw 2 of them go off to the side with trash bags, frantically trying to fill them up. And I asked them, "Why are you suddenly picking up trash?" And they told me that the soldiers had actually given them the trash bags and told them that if they were able to fill up their trash bags with trash, then they would be allowed through the checkpoint. Health violations are another major issue at these checkpoints and in the occupation in general. Here you can see a Palestinian green and white plated ambulance that's pulling over to the side of a road to allow a yellow plated Israeli vehicle privilege priority on that road. And these ambulances will sometimes wait for hours before reaching the checkpoints themselves. And when they get there, they're oftentimes not sort of rushed through quickly, but actually held at gunpoint, as you can see in this photograph, while another soldier will go around the back to sort of screen through the back of the ambulance. And the reasoning given for holding up ambulances oftentimes even longer than average civilian vehicles is that apparently in the past these ambulances have been used to transport weapons or people wanted by the Israeli government. And well, I've done a little research on the subject and discovered that actually there is one documented case of a Palestinian ambulance being abused for these purposes. But even if they were being used for these purposes, even if that was the case, remember that this Palestinian ambulance is traveling from a Palestinian village to a Palestinian city. It's not traveling from the West Bank into Israel, and that is where these checkpoints are located between Palestinian built-up areas, such that in what way is holding up this ambulance endangering the lives of the people in back of it? In what way is this contributing to the safety or the security of the Israeli population, let alone the entire Palestinian population? This is the checkpoint outside of the village of Deir Balut where I spent some time, and this checkpoint is open from 7 in the morning until 7 at night. What that means is that if you have any kind of an emergency between the hours of 7 p.m. and 7 a.m., well, you're kind of out of luck. And in fact, what happened was that a woman from the village who was 7 months pregnant with twins began to have contractions at 1 o'clock in the morning. Her husband drove her frantically to the checkpoint, which they needed to cross to reach the nearest hospital in the city of Ramallah, an hour away. They got to the checkpoint, and the soldiers who sleep above it came down to meet them and were very polite. And they said, look, the rule is very clear. Palestinians are not allowed through until 7 in the morning. Please come back at 7. Well, the woman obviously couldn't wait 6 hours to have her babies, and so they argued a bit more. And the soldiers, again, they were very polite and even apologetic, and they just kept saying the same thing over and over again. They said,